Welcome back to Second Chance, a series where I take an extended look back at games that didn't originally click with me during my first hour with them. This month, my patrons asked me to revisit Cave Story, or more accurately, Cave Story Plus. During my first hour with it, I loved spotting various influences from the Metroid franchise, as well as the variety and utility of each of the weapons. However, I was ultimately put off by the way that progression was halted until specific conversations with NPCs had occurred, as opposed to when new abilities had been acquired. Did more time with the game change that opinion, or was it just more of the same? First things first, I'd like to address the fact that this game is widely referred to as Metroidvania. That term, Metroidvania, is one that I personally try my best to avoid using in my videos, because it lacks a clear definition and can mean many different things to different people. To me, at its most basic, it refers to games where exploration plays a key component, and progression is blocked off or gated by what items and abilities you've unlocked, as opposed to keys you found or other arbitrary limitations. It frequently entails backtracking and branching paths, but isn't otherwise limited by theme or perspective. The thing about Cave Story is that even though it's commonly referred to as a Metroidvania, at least by my own personal definition, I'd argue that it's not only not a Metroidvania, it's actually a detriment to the game to be labeled as such. That's because overall, it's actually a very linear game, which inherently means that exploration is not a main component. And going in with an expectation of certain gameplay tropes, only for them to be absent, is inherently disappointing, and disingenuous to what the game actually is. Backtracking is not required, since new items don't unlock new parts of the map. And the truth is, there are even some locations that can't even be returned to. So if Cave Story isn't a Metroidvania, what is it? Well, to best describe it, I'd call it a narrative-driven platformer with an engaging weapon system. The weapon system, at its root level, is essentially experience-based modifications for each weapon. By that, I mean that as you use your gun and you collect the drops from each defeated enemy, the gun becomes more and more powerful. And at its most evolved state, additional perks are added to make them especially fun to use. My personal favorite upgrade happens when the machine gun hits the max level. The number of bullets is increased to the point that it adds enough recoil on the weapon to let you essentially hover if you shoot the ground while airborne. This mechanic is enjoyable enough that a full game could be made around it, and in fact, somebody has already done that. What stood out to me as odd though, was the fact that even after having the means of extended airtime via the machine gun, a jetpack is one of the few upgrades to be found in the game. By the time I collected it, I already had the means to get to any ledge, which just made collecting such a key item feel not very impressive or useful. The last thing I'll say about the gameplay is that while the controls are responsive, they're also borderline frustrating. It's hard to put a finger on why exactly that is, but if I had to say, I think it has to do with the combination of the fact that there's no startup delay when you first press a direction, yet there's a long drop-off period while movement peters out. It makes precision jumping more challenging than it otherwise would be, which is a bit unfortunate since that's a key component of any platformer. To progress the narrative, the game is essentially a series of fetch quests. Go there, grab a thing, and bring it back. It's all fairly straightforward, yet, due to the lack of branching paths, it isn't particularly challenging either. I mentioned it in my initial impressions, and it didn't change much in the full game, but where it breaks down for me the most is when there were times where I would go to complete a task, and the only reason it fails is that I hadn't talked to the correct NPC yet. For example, why would the correct course of action be to talk to an NPC standing outside of a doorway, when the mission I was given was to find and retrieve all of the dogs in an area? After repeatedly failing to get the dog to follow me, my first reaction was to re-explore the entire area for a different dog, because if this one was supposed to follow me, it would have already. There is no indication that talking to an NPC in a completely separate room is the correct course of action to take. And when I did figure it out, rather than having a euphoric aha moment, I walked away frustrated. The reason for making players talk to every NPC, as best as I can figure, is twofold. One, it encourages and even forces players to engage with the narrative. And two, it pads out the game by tricking players into experiencing the less than optimal ending. That's right. After my playthrough, I discovered that in order to achieve the best ending, there are certain characters that shouldn't be talked to. There's no way to know that on a first playthrough, so the perceived extra depth that is added by having multiple endings instead just ends up feeling like a cheap addition, and the player yet again feels stupid rather than empowered. That being said, the way the game teaches you about the fact that it has multiple endings is pretty entertaining and was a highlight for me. 3/4 of the way through the journey, one of the NPCs that you talk to tells you that he's leaving the land and offers you an escape. You're completely able to take him up on his offer and leave the world with the narrative unresolved. You may be labeled a coward, but hey, you technically finished the game. To be clear, I did not end my journey there, and I did continue playing long enough to achieve the good ending. The story unquestionably has some poignant moments, with one in particular that had me pause in my tracks. It's a story of personal sacrifice and dedication to others, but it never quite hit the highs necessary to get to a point where I can say I was emotionally impacted. Cave Story was a passion project made by just a single person, and that's something I know a thing or two about. I have massive respect for any creator or artist, but especially for those who choose to work independently. Toiling away, even on a passion project, can begin to feel like a chore, and releasing anything, whether it's a game, movie, music, painting, or whatever, is both incredibly brave and a monumental achievement that I never want to take away from. But for such a highly regarded game, I'm personally disappointed. I don't know if that's with Cave Story for not delivering, or in myself for not responding to it the way that many others have. Perhaps it could be argued that Cave Story was designed in a way that feeling discouraged and disappointed on the first playthrough is a critical step in making the true ending land successfully later on. But I can't say. I didn't experience the best ending. And with how I personally felt after beating it the first time, I'm pretty sure I won't be going back to revisit it again. Thank you for sticking with this one to the end. I know you've all heard it before, but just by watching my videos, you're really helping make me grow, and I appreciate that. I'd also like to give a special shout out and thank you to my patrons, who are not only awesome and amazing, but they selected this one for me to play this month. You all are the best. Until next time.